Have you ever taken on a Title IX investigation? My guest specializes in them. He's a Harvard-trained attorney and a former prosecutor in New York. He specialized in sex crimes. Now he's a sexual misconduct investigator at his own firm and an adjunct professor at Fordham Law School, where he teaches courses on sexual misconduct and domestic violence cases. And he's the author of 2 novels that draw from his experiences with these kinds of cases. We'll find out more about all of that when we come back.
To get more intel on the real work of private eyes, subscribe to our YouTube channel, read pursuitmag.com, and take classes at PI Education.
Welcome back to The Sound of Pursuit. I'm Hal Humphreys, your host. Let me bring in my guest, Dan Schorr. Dan, thank you, number one, for taking the time to be here. And then just really quickly, fill us in on your legal background. How did you come to specialize in sexual misconduct cases?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. It's great to talk with you. A little over 25 years ago, when I graduated law school, I was deciding what I wanted to do next, and I really wanted to work in the DA's office in New York. And I got to work on, as an intern, a few different types of cases, and the sexual misconduct, domestic violence cases really hit me in a more powerful way. I thought these were ongoing, challenging cases that involved a lot of nuance and complication. You could really help people. And I became a sex crimes, domestic violence, child abuse prosecutor back then.
Okay. A lot of private investigators have a real hard time taking on sex crimes cases, especially when they're working for the defense. And I've got my way of explaining how you get your head around that as an investigator, but from an attorney's perspective, what would be the argument for it's good as a private investigator to consider taking on sex crimes cases for the defense?
Sure. And I just want to stress my role is generally as a neutral person working for institutions. But I think it's so important in these cases that there be due process for people accused of sexual misconduct, that you want to make sure that the person making the report gets support and that there's a full investigation. But if someone is accused of sexual harassment, sexual assault, they need to have someone on their side challenging the evidence. That's part of due process. And that is an extremely important part of our judicial system, investigative system. And so if people take on that work and they do it in good faith, then that's important.
I like that you use the phrase good faith. I have worked on a number of alleged sexual crimes, a few involving crimes against children, a few involving just your kind of he said, she said cases that come up, which are really difficult to work on, especially when there's not much evidence. And I respect it from the point of view of the prosecution. I think it's absolutely critical that we have, thoughtful, dogged prosecutors that will go out there and track down the truth in these cases. Along the same lines, I think it's absolutely critical that we have respectful, dogged defense attorneys to track down these things and suss out. I mean, I love the idea of a criminal justice system. The adversarial nature of it allows for everybody to come to the table prepared for a fight. And then, hopefully, the truth will out itself in the process. For our listeners, I'm very comfortable talking about the idea of investigating sex crimes of pretty much any kind, but we're talking today, and your books involve, I think, specifically Title IX investigations. Give us a quick primer on Title IX. What is this law, and how did it come to be? What, as relates to, like, I think in terms of sex crimes, but Title IX has some specific things to it. So tell me what Title IX is and how it came to be.
Sure. And this could be a very long answer, but I'll give you a brief summary. And so in 1972, a little over 50 years ago, we had Title IX enacted, and that made sure that there could not be discrimination on the basis of sex for educational institutions receiving federal financial assistance. So basically, all colleges and universities, most K-12 schools fall, except for a few, fall into this category. It was a lot of focus on sports equity back then, that men and women's teams were not being funded the same way, that boys and men had a lot more resources and opportunities in athletics that girls and women didn't have. Over time, there was a recognition through case law, through executive action, through the White House and other places that there needed, if someone was being sexually harassed or sexually assaulted on campus or part of their educational program, that they also were being denied an equal opportunity to participate, and that schools had a responsibility to investigate these cases and to adjudicate them with policies that were clear, investigations that were fair. And then over time, there's been additional structures put in to have due process for people accused of these cases, such as a hearing where people can have cross-examination of the accuser and witnesses. And I often serve as a hearing officer in matters where I'm not serving as the investigator. So that's a short summary of where we are today. But now we have campuses have a requirement under Title IX to investigate allegations of sexual assault and other sexual misconduct that in the past wasn't always acted upon. Now
Yeah.
it's strictly in law.
Okay. Do these procedures fall under administrative law? Is that how that works?
Well, there's regulations that are under Title IX. The Office of Civil Rights and the Education Department enforces them, and then schools have to have their own policies to based on the requirements of the Title IX regulations. And there's flexibility on the type of steps that you have in a hearing or an investigation, but the certain basic principles, such as the ability to cross-examine somebody. So it's not a court of law, it's not a judicial proceeding. It's sort of like an administrative hearing, although it's not specifically characterized that way. It's an educational institution having a hearing that should enforce due process and also the rights for both the complainant and the respondent.
Okay, okay, good. I thank you for clearing that up because I've always kind of wondered how this works. And I'll be honest up front, I have never worked on a Title IX
Mhm.
case. I was asked by an attorney to look at one, and I think he was offended by my fee quote.
Okay.
And I think that may be one of the struggles for investigators getting into this work. You know, a lot of lawyers that are taking on these kind of cases on the civil side of things, they're working out of a war chest of their own money to go through the process,
Mhm.
and they don't get paid unless there's a settlement at the end. So, um, a lot of private investigators who are listening may have experience with Title IX and other civil rights investigations, but I'd say most don't.
Mhm.
So, for the uninitiated, explain how these investigations work.
Sure. And I also want to stress that these types of investigations can go on outside of educational institutions. So it could be in government, in companies, in nonprofits where there's
Okay.
sexual misconduct. So what I'm about to say, it's very prevalent now in Title IX, but it also exists other places. But if there's an allegation on a campus of sexual assault, then usually an investigator will be appointed who's a neutral investigator. It could be someone in-house, it could be an external person who puts together a report after interviewing people, looking at all evidence, getting documents. A lot of text messages and social media are relevant, especially involving college students in these allegations.
Yeah.
And now, for the last 5 years, because of federal regulations, we have a second step where then there's a separate hearing officer or hearing panel that reviews the results of that investigation and hears from witnesses at the hearing and then makes a determination about whether the person violated the campus policy, usually with a preponderance of the evidence standard, which is the same standard as a civil case, but I'm sure your listeners know much lower than a criminal case.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Now, I'm just going to go on a limb here and guess that these cases can sometimes be huge, unwieldy cases where you're untangling a pot of spaghetti of evidence and statements and those kind of things. When you know a case is going to be a long, drawn out, and complex process, where do you start?
Well, if you're the investigator, and I get a lot of cases that do seem extremely complex at the beginning, I think you always need to start from the beginning of reading the allegations and then looking at whatever documentation you have. You want to do that before you do any interviews, and then talk to the complainant, the person who brought the allegations, because sometimes what they tell you is different than what was originally alleged. And then go from there. We usually identify other witnesses who might be helpful. I'm concerned immediately about evidence that might not exist. So if there's security camera footage, most of those security cameras have 30-day cycles. And if you get the assignment on day 25 and you wait a week, you may lose something that's really important. Or social media, people delete social media. So many text messages are relevant to these cases, what people are texting about before, after, during an alleged sexual assault or sexual harassment. So I want to get that, and then I want to talk to the respondent. I also want to make sure that the respondent and the complainant have the opportunity to tell me what evidence they think might be relevant, what witnesses they have they think I should interview. And an investigator doesn't always interview everyone that a party tells you to interview, but certainly we take it very seriously. If someone says, "Oh, this is a person who was with me," they could tell you this did not happen like that. You want to talk with them. And then you want to write a clear report. I think report writing is so important to these matters because, as you said, they could be unwieldy and complicated. And if the report doesn't show it in a clear narrative, that's really important. And I think there's a big connection between fiction writing and report writing for investigations, even though obviously fiction is different in many significant ways. A report of an investigation is telling a story in a clear way where the reader can understand who are the main people, what is supporting something, what is not supporting something, what's contradictory. So there's less flair to an investigative report is going to be pretty dry. A fiction novel like mine is supposed to be more entertaining, but I think telling a clear narrative is an essential part of both of those.
I think it's really interesting and cool that you talk about the idea of you're telling a story. And I have a young attorney that I work with out in Fort Worth, Texas, by the name of Frank Sellers, and we always put together a players list. Who all is involved in this
Hmm.
case? Who are the players we're going to be dealing with? And then, the other thing, mentioning the video evidence usually cycles off after 30 days. It starts to re-record on to the device. The importance of sooner rather than later in these types of investigation. I think in every type of investigation, sooner is always better. Um, you know, I'm a huge fan of spoliation letters. If you come to it on day 25, yes, send out those letters. Notice people don't get rid of this evidence. Make sure you pull the hard drive, whatever. Um, but at the end of the day, getting started sooner than later is so critical. And I speak sometimes to attorneys, and I make that point whenever I speak to investigators. I've never met an investigator that wants to come to the party late. They would love to get there first and get there quickly. But I think attorneys, a lot of times, I mean, all of my attorney friends that do defense work are crazy busy, over tasks. They've got so much going on, and it's hard sometimes to stop and say, I need to go ahead and order my investigator to come in and start that process. But I think it's critical that we do that as part of a defense team. And then the last thing I would say to my answer to the question of where do you start is always how do you eat an elephant?
You gotta start somewhere, right?
One bite at a time.
Yeah.
One bite at a time. Interviewing witnesses is one of my absolute favorite things to do. It is kind of the space that I live in. I love doing witness interviews. I have found over the years that the more of those interviews I do with really traumatic experiences, you as an interviewer kind of stack this accumulated trauma over years of doing these kind of interviews. These interviews can be fraught. They can be difficult, especially when we're talking about someone who is a victim of sexual assault or harassment case, something like that. What advice do you have for investigators who are interviewing witnesses, accusers, and the accused in cases like these?
Well, one is you need to be comfortable with the subject matter because it's very normal for some people to just not be comfortable talking about specific acts of sexual interaction, sexual assault. Many of the cases involving allegations of non-consensual sexual interactions involve the complainant talking about what was consensual before it became non-consensual. And I think a lot of people, for whatever reason, don't feel comfortable talking about that. And then sometimes investigators feel forced to engage in an interview like that. And I think it is important for investigators sometimes to say to themselves, I'm just not the right person for this matter. If you're not, maybe find a colleague or someone else, or become more comfortable. And becoming more comfortable may be going to training classes. Or sometimes there are certain allegations that involve conduct that someone may personally find really uncomfortable talking about. Maybe there's BDSM activity that they're not comfortable with. And I think sometimes even just practicing by yourself or with a colleague or talking to a mirror and talking about terms that you're going to use during the interview so you're comfortable saying them is important, because if someone being interviewed sees that the interviewer is not comfortable, they're not going to be comfortable because they're probably not comfortable anyway talking to a stranger about these things. So that's one thing I would say: preparation, become comfortable, and then be really sensitive to both sides, both the complainant and the respondent. If they need a break, if they need time, if they're hesitant. I think sometimes investigators feel if someone's hesitant, that means they're not being truthful. And I think especially in these cases, both for the complainant and respondent, there's a lot of discomfort and hesitancy. So I wouldn't read too much into that alone for either party. So those are some tips that I have.
Yeah, I think there's been so much um, pretty decent fiction in the form of television and movies and some books about deception detection and body language experts and what I would call
Mhm.
um, snake oil salesmen out there saying if someone does this, it means that. What I've learned over years of doing interviews is when someone starts doing one of the red flag body language things, it doesn't mean they're lying necessarily. It means they may be uncomfortable about whatever we're talking about, and that's something we need to talk more about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's this stereotype of like you look into someone's soul and you could tell if they're telling the truth or not. In reality, though, what I like to do, I'm sure you do, and a lot of the listeners do, is I want to take people in detail through their narrative and maybe do it more than once during the interview, follow up and see if they're consistent. Are they inconsistent? And are they open to discussing things? If they're not open, is there a plausible reason why they're not open to it? Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. And then looking at what's consistent with other witnesses, inconsistent with other witnesses, things like that. And then also, I feel like almost every account, whether it's a complainant or respondent, even if it's truthful, there's always things that sometimes are referred to as bad facts for their side. Maybe someone had a poor judgment when they did something. And I think how people respond to being questioned about those things, like does someone get overly defensive, or do they say, yes, I know I shouldn't have said this, that was disrespectful, but I did not engage in the other sexual harassment that they're saying. And I think that kind of language is often helpful in understanding someone's credibility.
Yeah, I think so. Again, and I think you'll agree with me on this. The best way to know when someone is telling you something contrary to fact is to know as much of the facts as you possibly can.
Absolutely.
So before I go into an interview, I spend hours prepping for that interview. I'll read everything that the person has said, any statements they've made. I'll try to get as much information about factual stuff as I can. And then tell me, Dan, just tell me if I'm thinking about this right. I mean, truth is one thing, fact may be another. Facts are what they are. Truth is sometimes open to interpretation. My personal truth about a thing can be X, Y, or Z. But facts are just facts. Am I wrong about that?
I think it depends on what aspect you're referring to. I think what actually happened, I would say the truth and the facts are the same, but how someone perceived it and how they felt about it and what their intent was, and that might be what you're referring to. Yeah, someone may say like I said that, but that's not what I meant. And
Yes.
then the other person may say, well, this is how I received it. And they're both being truthful. And that's why it's really important in all these cases to follow the policy of the organization or the law if you're following the law. Like, what are the definitions? Because you're not, when you're doing an investigation like this, you're not deciding this person's a good person, this person's a bad person. You're deciding, does the evidence from whatever standard you're using, whether preponderance the evidence or something else, does it show a violation of the school policy or the organizational policy or whatever it is?
Yeah, I love that. That's great. And the reason I go through that little exercise of fact versus truth is I'm just constantly trying to work out my understanding of those two concepts. And anytime I get the chance to ask it to someone that's smarter than I am, I do. You talked earlier about the difficulty of some of the conversations we have in these cases, and you mentioned BDSM cases. I worked on a case a couple of years ago that involved the website FetLife, and the interviews were for me incredibly awkward.
Hmm.
And part of the research I had to do to get ready for the interviews was talk to our client about what does this mean, what does this mean, and it's all part of the process of getting ready for the thing. But I think you can get yourself more comfortable with those questions and those conversations if you have them with various people before you get to talk to the witness. Talk them
Yeah.
through with the attorney, talk them through with your client, talk them through with other people that you trust that are on the team.
Yeah, I think that's all good. The preparation, talking through these things in advance, that's really important. I'm at a point in my career where I've been investigating these cases for so long that I feel comfortable talking about anything. And maybe that's a weird quality that I have, but I feel like I've talked about everything although I have to say, every time I say I've seen it all, I have another case that's I'm like, oh no, I haven't seen it all because this is totally different, especially with college students. There's new ways that people are interacting, whether it's through cyber stalking or just interactions involving sexual activity. But I would say that getting that comfort level is important, and also appearing comfortable when you're talking to someone. So even if you do all those things, you try to get comfortable, you talk to people, you prepare, and you're still uncomfortable, I do think it's important to have the discipline to act comfortable, because if you look uncomfortable, the other person's not going to feel comfortable trusting you to give you a truthful account.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to put the stick down and step away from the horse of interviewing witnesses. Um, you also serve as a hearing officer for Title IX matters. What does that mean?
Sure. So after, as we talked about, after a Title IX investigation, it goes to a hearing now. This is based on federal regulations from 2020, so we're 5 years into it, and the educational institution will hold a hearing where there's a complainant, a respondent, the witnesses. Both sides have advisors. They could be attorneys, they're not always attorneys. And the witnesses are called at the hearing officer, and sometimes a hearing panel if schools use 3 people. They question the witnesses, question the parties, the advisors for each side cross-examine people. And even though it's not a criminal proceeding, these are high stakes hearings, because if someone experienced sexual misconduct, whether or not the other person's held accountable is crucially important to them. And on the flip side, if someone's accused of sexual misconduct and they're found responsible, even though it's not a criminal finding or a civil finding, that could be extremely damaging to their future academic career, their professional career. So these are high stakes hearings. And I always try to make sure that everyone at these hearings, when I'm the hearing officer, is treated with respect, that my questions are not accusatory. They're done to try to understand the matter better. And then we talked about explaining things in a report. I write a decision after about why certain evidence is persuasive, why certain evidence is not. And then often schools have appeal processes that are pretty narrow, but people can appeal the decision. So these are generally done via video conference like Zoom, just like we're talking on Zoom today.
Okay.
They are not usually in person, both for technological reasons, makes it easier to assemble people, but also people do seem to be more comfortable attending the hearings via Zoom and not having to be in the same room as the person who they're accusing or the person who's accusing them.
Yeah. Yeah. That's all just crazy interesting. Dan, I appreciate you taking the time to walk through those things. I want to kind of switch gears one more time and get into a little bit more about Dan. You're a published author. Your first novel, Final Table, came out in 2021. I have not had a chance to read that one. Can you tell us real quickly, number one, a little bit about the novel, but how did you decide to become a novel writer?
Sure. So the final table itself is about high profile sexual misconduct allegations in the worlds of high stakes poker and international politics. And I based this on some allegations that I've had in cases I've investigated. I have always wanted to write fiction. My mother was an English teacher, high school English teacher when I was a kid, gave me books to read. We talked about them. I was a college English major, and I've always been writing. My first novel was published 4 years ago, but I've always been writing fiction. And as you know, the work we do gives a lot of material for interesting cases. And what I try to do in both my novels is I want to show people a side of the world that they probably haven't seen. That maybe your audience has seen it a little more as they're investigators. But I feel like there is a certain group of novels that are formula novels, and some people want formula novels where it's the same spy thriller or the same romance novel. And I've seen it before, but I like it and I want to see it again. That's not my writing style. I want to show people a world that they probably haven't seen before and behind the scenes of how things work.
Yeah, I love it. And moving on to Open Bar, your latest book, when was that published?
That was just published in August, so August of 2025. It's brand new. It's available through ebook, regular book, audiobook, and really exciting to have it out there in the world because it's been in my head and with the editors for so long, and now hearing people actually know the story and talk about it is really exciting.
Yeah, so do you by chance have a brief passage you'd be willing to read for us?
I can read the opening page if you'd like,
I would
if that's
love that.
helpful. It kind of kickstarts the story. All right. So I'm going to read the first page, chapter one. Serena, age doesn't matter, especially with someone as mature as you. Serena allowed these toxic words to marinate in her mind as she reached into the top right drawer of her mahogany desk and withdrew a stick of cinnamon gum from the open pack. She would have preferred one of her peppermint lozenges, but sometimes they gave her short-lived sneezing fits, and there wasn't time for that. Instead, she delicately peeled back the gum wrapper, then shoved the spicy stick into her mouth, which had remained agape since she'd read those same words on yet another document 3 minutes ago. She slowly began to chew and savor the needed pop of soothing flavor while glancing at the beautiful campus around the second floor office window, red brick buildings, lush green fields, stone paths, and the immaculate new student center that would open soon after the undergraduates returned in mass and this sparsely populated summer world once again burst into frenzied activity. For the past 48 hours, Serena had pored over hundreds of documents buried in the legal department's electronic archives. One father's call had initiated her search while simultaneously plunging her into a cauldron of unbearable guilt. Now it was time to get other people involved. So I try to set the stage from the beginning that she's uncovered long held sexual harassment, sexual assault. And I start with that line, age doesn't matter, especially with someone as mature as you, because that's something that the offender in this case kept saying to his underage victims. And that comes directly from cases I've investigated. I've had so many cases with teachers, counselors, religious figures who are sexually assaulting underage boys and girls. And they're often saying, don't worry about age, you're mature. I hear that all the time, unfortunately. It's tragic to hear. So I wanted to show that in this case.
I think it's a really strong way to start the narrative, and it illustrates right up front, right in your face, we're dealing with a potential sexual predator of children. And that is something that most of us out here in the world are horrified by.
Mhm.
Anyone who's a parent is terrified of something like that happening. I think does a really good job of setting the stage for um, kind of how high the stakes are in this case. There are a couple of things, and I'm not going to give any spoilers here because I want people to read this book. If you have not yet, um, go to Amazon, go to your local bookstore, wherever it is you buy books, buy a copy of Open Bar, take the time to read it. I literally got the book on Friday and finished it Saturday evening because I found it so engaging. And I'm not just blowing sunshine, Dan. I really enjoyed the book.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
There were a couple of, I don't know if these are literary devices, but they felt like I'm thinking specifically of Serena
Yeah.
and some of her personal holdups. Like she won't start a novel on an evening because she has to finish a novel in a certain number of days. And there are reasons for that that involve the
Yeah.
way her parents treated her when she was a child. It seemed to me and it seemed to me that that was like a genius way to illustrate the micro traumas and how they impact how we behave and act as adults, which was a really good way for me as a reader to understand, oh, she's got these little things that have gone on in her background. This child that's involved as a primary complainant has a massive thing that has happened in her past, and it is impacting her adult life.
Well, thank you for picking up on that. I really appreciate that because that was definitely what I was trying to show. And one thing that's so interesting and cathartic about writing novels like this is that every single thing in the novel is either pulled from my life or pulled from someone else's life. And I think, oh, someone who's told me about their life or an investigation I've done. And, I use my imagination to try to streamline the story and make it entertaining. But at the same time, something like that is something I pulled from my own life when I was much, much younger. I would often be thinking like that. And I wanted this character to be neurotic. I think I've moved beyond those thoughts at this point in my life, but I know earlier I used to worry about stuff like that. And I wanted this character to be consumed with some issues like that because I think it informs how she acts in response to the sexual misconduct allegations also.
I love it. Well, Dan, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to be with us today. It has been, for me, an absolutely wonderful conversation. Tell us again, where can we find your book? If I were a private investigator or anyone else out there that wanted to find your book, how do I find it? Where do I buy it?
Sure. So Open Bar, which is the novel that's out now, there's an audiobook, there's an ebook, and there's physical book. Also, they go to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, their local bookstore. I also write a regular column on Substack. So I think that's the best way for people to find me if they want to engage. I write about fiction, I write about writing and reading, and I oversee a book club that's a really fun book club that we meet about different books. So people could go to Substack, search for my name, Dan Schorr, and join me there. And I really encourage people to reach out if they have questions, if they have book clubs and would like me to come to their book club to answer questions. I always enjoy that. That's always a thrill.
And speaking of that, do you have any book events coming up?
I do. I'm going to be putting them public in the next week or two. There's one in New York City that'll be occurring. There might be one in the Maryland, Baltimore area. So Substack's the main place that I put that out. I also have a website, danschorrbooks.com, but those are the main place people can go. And I would love to interact with people who are interested in learning about these books or reading them. I think it's a lot of fun to discuss them.
I love it. I have a co-host of this podcast that we have a hard time coordinating our schedules to get on all of the podcasts together. But he is a private investigator. He's actually an attorney, but he's not practicing. He's an investigator. And his name is John Nardizzi. He is in Boston, and he is an absolutely fantastic investigator. And he's written a novel himself. So I will make sure that John Nardizzi gets a note to come to your book event in Boston when you're there.
That's great. I look forward to that. Thank you.
Yeah. Again, thank you for taking the time to be here. For my listeners, order Dan's new novel, Open Bar. And if you want a deeper dive into Title IX investigations after listening to this, check out Dan's podcast, the Title IX and Civil Rights Podcast, on your favorite podcast platform. And I'm subscribing to that podcast as soon as we got off of this call, Dan.
Well, great. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking with you. And I think that your insights into investigations are really helpful. And I'm sure your audience will have a lot of thoughts about what we talked about today. So thanks for having me on.
Dan, thank you so much. And for our listeners, that is your Sound of Pursuit this week. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to The Sound of Pursuit, a podcast by Pursuit Magazine and PI Education.